What's happening, folks? Today I'm sitting down with a buddy of mine who I met after I'd been following him, reading, learning from him for a very long time.
Why would a fifth generation witch become a Christian?
An incredible deep thinker.
Whether you believe in God or you don't, God, where are you?
I love how he handles logic, cold hard facts, and assimilates that into a masterful worldview. We'll have arguments that many of you have never heard before. And when you see them, when you hear them, I think you'll be astounded. It really recalibrates a lot of the way people think in an open-handed and intellectually honest way. My guest is Sean McDowell. Sean, say hello to Warrior Post Society.
John, this is a treat, man. Good to be with you.
Awesome, man. Very good. Very good. Guys, Sean holds a PhD from Talbot. He is a professor at Biola University. He's a speaker. He has authored and co-authored numerous books. Let's see. I'm looking through my cheat sheet here. I got excited. I spilled into my bio a little already, just right off the rip. But married 23 years now, and you have 3 kids. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And then you wear a lot of Spider-Man and Marvel apparel too. Are you guilty on that charge?
I've pretty much either Biola gear or superhero gear is kind of my gig.
Fantastic. Everyone's got a thing, and that is
right.
Awesome. All right, so we'll start with a few warm-up questions, and then we'll get into some meat and potatoes. Sound good?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Avengers get in an all, fight. Who's the last man standing?
Oh, Thor for sure.
For sure. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Weights or cardio?
Oh, weights, and only cardio is necessary.
Got it. Live in a time period other than this one.
1st century AD.
Wow. You know you're going to get flayed alive, though, right?
Earlier on, before the persecution starts.
There you go. I'm going to retire on Patmos, A Nigerian prince actually comes through and is going to gift you either a castle, an off-grid homestead, or a mansion. They're all worth the same.
Oh, probably off-grid homestead, for sure, yeah.
Family trip to the mountains or to the beach?
Beach, most of the time.
You could tame any dangerous animal that is living, nothing mythological, and that would be your pet. What are you going with?
Great white shark.
A great white shark. You didn't have like a swimming pool for that?
I don't know. You didn't ask. You just said any animal.
It's true. I guess if you went in the castle, he could patrol your moat. That would have gone better with that, I suppose.
Yeah.
Let's see. Superpower of choice.
Ooh. Super speed. I'm going with a flash speed.
It's a good call. Favorite author?
Oh, gosh. I'm just going to have to give you a few. I really have been influenced by Philip Yancey and by Henry Nouwen, a Catholic writer. Neither of those are apologists, but have had a deep influence on me over my life.
A Catholic writer? Did the other Protestants know you're cheating on them?
His writings are brilliant. You would love them.
It's right. I adore G.K. Chesterton, and we totally lost him.
Okay.
We had him for a moment, and then he defected. I'm like, but man, I love him. He's a champ. All right, so let's jump into the main questions. First off, you're talking about faith all the time. You talk about religion. You also get outside of that into peripheral philosophical issues. But I wanted to know, as you're constantly interacting with students, you're traveling the country speaking, how spiritual or atheistic is America today in your viewpoint?
So statistically speaking, more people will describe themselves as nones, N-O-N-E-S, which doesn't all mean atheists and agnostics. But we've also seen an increase in those who identify as atheist and agnostic, but it's still a small percentage of the population as a whole. I actually think we're hitting a point in our culture where there's kind of a meaning crisis, and people are more open and hungry for deeper truths than maybe they have taken for granted in the past. Some of that is coming out of COVID. Some of that is just our increased political polarization. Some of that is just nonstop news, just exhausting people. And so my sense is, Gen Z included, that they are very open and eager to spiritual conversations if it's framed in the right way at the right time and in the right place.
Got it. Do you have any statistical information on kind of like we were this Christian before and now we're less, or this is how much atheism has grown? And if somebody's in the religious category, but not necessarily a specific religion, how kind of spiritual are they? Can you dig down a little bit and nuts and bolts? What are the kind of big worldview belief systems across America?
Well, I don't know that I have all those stats directly on hand, to be honest with you.
Kind of generally. I'm not going to hold your feet to the... I don't have Pew Research open beside me.
No, man,
here.
I just appreciate that you thought I might have those handy without any prep on what you were going to ask me. So thank you for that question. The big increase we've seen is going back to like the 1960s, but it really grew in the 90s, at least when I was in high school, and then really has somewhat flattened recently in the past Pew study, is this increase in this group known as the nones, Nones. That's one of the biggest stories on religion. And what this means is less people are identifying through the lens of religion and faith as they did in the past. So if you ask most people, John, hey, how important is faith to you? They'll say, oh, it's important, religion, God, that matters. But if you flip the question and ask people, what's most important? And how do you identify yourself? What actually rarely will come up is faith and God and religion. So this shift towards the nones, and that means less people going to church, less people reading their Bible. In her book on iGen, the letter I, Gen, written by Jean Twenge on Gen Z, she's like, we are seeing a massive shift towards a secular society as it comes to faith and this generation. Now, calling something post-Christian is somewhat loaded because it implies something about where we were. But in terms of a value for the scriptures, identifying as Christian, we are seeing a radical shift away from that in the culture as a whole. That's, I think, the shift that really matters. So still a majority of Americans will say they're Christians. But if you probe down on what their beliefs are, even studies on like the state of the Bible and the state of evangelicals, I don't remember the numbers, but it was like somewhere between 20 and 30% of people who say, I'm a Christian and I believe in the Bible, believe that Jesus sinned. Like 20 to 30%.
Wow.
Now that is about as basic of a Christian belief that Jesus was sinless and thus could die on the cross for our sins. How you call yourself a Christian and embrace that is beyond me. But I think we're just seeing less precision, less care, less attentiveness to theology than maybe we did in the past. Although, like I said earlier, I think there's an openness to spiritual things and a yearning from a lot of people that things aren't just working the way, it has been. Hence, mental health increase and depression, anxiety, and loneliness. All those things are up. So I think there's a spiritual yearning that's there.
Wow. I was thinking about this morning, just how our country seems to be divided into two completely separate value systems. It's not just that we, believe something different politically, like our ideas, like you have a different way that the economy might be better off. It seems like to be two different baskets of values. And of those baskets, each side has their strict allegiances. But it's like, if I know one of your values, I could probably effectively guess 10 other values. And so it's just amazing to me that it's so cleanly divided into two separate baskets of values. How did we get to that point? What's kind of underneath to power it in those two ways as you're looking at the undergirding philosophical structures?
Man, that is a tough question, how we got here kind of historically speaking. I'm not sure I can perfectly answer that. I don't know how many people really think through the deeper underlying philosophical structures that shape their political and worldview commitments. I don't think most people thought about, what does it mean to be free? What is a human being? What is the objective good of society? Like, what is human nature? Like, I don't think we've thought through these things. I think for most of us, we're a part of a tribe. And so if I identify with a certain political position, and my family does or my church does, The reason you can know those 10 other viewpoints is because people in that compartment hold those 10 other viewpoints. So I'm a little less sanguine that most people have really thought through why they hold the beliefs that they do. And I think a lot of the differences between political parties stem from very basic things like, what is the nature of freedom? What is human nature? Are we naturally good? Are we naturally sinful? These core human beliefs, I'd love to see a lot more reflection upon those, and then see if our voting and our political position is a result of thinking those through, as opposed to just the group that we happen to be a part of. Hence, you know A, and you've got B, C, D, E, like you said.
Gotcha. You said worldview. Can you kind of give me a definition of what a worldview is?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's basically a view of the world. Now I'm messing with you, of course. Of course you know that. But it's a perspective of life. It's a philosophy. So everybody has some way that they think the world works. Now, a lot of us have not thought about what our philosophy of life is, let alone where it came from and if it's true or not. You might think of a worldview as kind of the air we breathe and the water we swim in. It's assumptions that we have that shape how we live. So if you look at an iceberg, like what's above the iceberg is maybe how somebody votes, maybe how they live, how they spend their money. It's their actions that we can see. But below that, like you said, I would actually say below actions would be somebody's values, like you mentioned. Below that is somebody's worldview that shapes their values. And I think worldviews are most deeply formed through the relationships that we have. But just think of a worldview as kind of like glasses you put on, so to speak, or a mental map about reality. And so if our map isn't accurate, then it's going to distort our values and, of course, distort the way that we live.
Interesting. I would think a rational being would kind of start at the very basic, kind of some of those key questions and then key values and grow up from there. But you seem to a moment ago say the exact opposite of like, no, you belong to a tribe. And then you kind of adopt everything else as if we're not the rational, logical creatures that we fool ourselves into thinking. We're actually more just gregarious creatures that are taking up creeds of our party and tribe. Is that kind of fair? Because it seems a flip-flop way of like there's what how we think we get our beliefs and values, and then how we actually are.
So in Romans 12:2, Paul says, don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Now, don't be conformed is a commandment. Don't do this. Why would he say not to be conformed? Because our default position is to be conformed to the environment and people and relationships around us. That's what we naturally default to. So I think about as a kid, I had Play-Doh, and we'd have like these plastic encasings that were like the Death Star or a lightsaber, and that would squish the Play-Doh, and the Play-Doh would be conformed to the image of the plastic encasing. In a sense, Paul is saying don't be conformed, and he has to command us not to be conformed because naturally we just kind of adopt the beliefs of our parents, our friends, our church, our political party without rationally going step by step through it. Instead, he says, rather be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Transformed is active rather than passive. So he's calling us to be rational. He's calling us to use our minds, but I don't think we naturally do that. And there's a ton of studies that have come out. Like a lot of lawyers know this. Like they're not going to line up their arguments and their ducks in a row, assuming we are rational people and always just do where the data points. You've got to appeal to somebody emotively. You got to appeal to somebody through telling stories. There's other ways to persuade, but we need to use our minds. And I think Paul is calling us back to that in Romans 12.
I love that. That's fantastic. So for a worldview, to be able to bring all of the emotive response, the intellectual responses, and I have all these different possible worldviews. Maybe there is no God. Maybe there is a God, but it's kind of more checked out in a deistic conception, or there's all these different religions, and you are an apologist for the Christian worldview. Could you give us some way of an elevator defense, just kind of a flyover of all the terrain of how we could begin to see the Christian worldview as the most correct?
What's unique about Christianity is that it calls us to use our minds and to examine the evidence. This is not true in many, if not most, other major religions. In Isaiah, God says, "Come, let us reason together." Jesus said, "Love God with your heart and with your soul and with your mind." Jesus did public miracles. Why? Partly he was healing people and he was good, but they were attestations to support his claim to be the divine Messiah. When the apostles go out in Acts chapter 2, when the church begins, Peter gives a sermon. And if you just read it in Acts chapter 2, I'd invite even if you're not a Christian, just open up and read Acts chapter 2. Jesus had ascended. It's called Pentecost. It's the beginning of the church a few weeks after Jesus had ascended. And Peter's giving this first sermon. And Peter lays out these evidences that Christianity is true, done publicly that people knew in Jerusalem. And he says, follow the evidence. And we were witnesses of this. So the first thing to realize, this is very different than other religions. Christianity says God has given you a mind, use your mind, examine the evidence and follow it. And Jesus did public evidence. Now, we could walk through a lot of this. I believe in a cumulative case approach. So there's evidence that the universe had a beginning. It's not eternal. That points to a cause outside of the universe that is a beginner, that's timeless and spaceless and causeless. We also know the laws of physics and cosmology are incredibly fine-tuned to allow the emergence and sustenance of life. The best explanation is a fine-tuner. We look in the cell, and if you took one cell out in your body, you have an average 30 trillion cells in your body. The DNA in one cell uncoils to about 6 feet in length. So if I took all the DNA in about your body and my body, we're probably both pretty averagely sized, roughly speaking. If you strung it together, it would go from here to the sun and back about 200 times. Just the DNA in your body or my body. That stores information more complex than anything humans can invent today. That information points towards an information giver. I would argue the moral law, we know there's right and we know there's wrong. That points towards a moral law giver. I think consciousness that we have can't emerge from matter. It points towards a larger consciousness. So, beginning of the universe to beginner, fine-tuner, information giver, moral law giver. So now we have a mind that is moral. The question is, has this God spoken and made himself known? And what uniquely sets Christianity apart is Jesus didn't say, here's how you get to God, here's how you find truth. He actually claimed to be God in human flesh. Buddha didn't claim this. No other major religious figure claimed that. But then he did public miracles, including the ultimate miracle, dying on the cross, buried in a tomb, which was discovered empty. And then all these people, the 500, the 12 apostles, women, skeptics like Thomas, Jewish followers, non-believers like Paul, and the brother of Jesus, James, saying, we've seen the risen Jesus. And then they start this religion that turns the world upside down, rooted in seeing Jesus risen from the grave. And you commented earlier in the first century, I would have been flayed to death at that point. Obviously kidding, but I did my dissertation on the deaths of the apostles. And they're out preaching that Jesus is risen. They're being threatened, beaten, thrown in prison, and some of them martyred distinctly tied to their faith. That is the beginning of a case, I think, that Christianity best explains the world as we live in it. Now, the last thing I would say is every worldview diagnoses something wrong in the world. Marxism says it's external to us. There's haves and have-nots, capitalism. New Age says we forgot that we were God. Islam, part of the world, is we're just not submitted to Allah. Jesus said that what's wrong with the world is the human heart. It's broken and it's corrupt. And I got to tell you, John, looking at my own heart and looking at the world, I think Jesus got it exactly right. He diagnosed the human condition well. So I think the evidence is there and it fits my experience. That's in part why I'm a Christian.
That's awesome. There's some folks that are just, despite all kinds of different evidence, and you cited from philosophical arguments, you gave me scientific arguments, you gave me historical arguments. You didn't even really tap much into, well, no, you just gave kind of more of an introspective, experiential argument, an existential one. I'm like, well, holy cow, yeah, it's covering bases. What, though, as you're talking to different students, you're debating people, what are the key objections for the Christian worldview that keep coming up over and over again?
So I would say a lot of the objections today there's certain scientific objections. A lot of people think if I'm going to become a Christian, do I have to stop following what science tells me is true about, say, maybe things like evolution, whatever it is? There's still a high regard for science. I think there's a lot of objections about Christianity being exclusive. What about hell? What about saying Jesus is the only way? And also tied to, why does God allow evil? And then some of the bigger objections I get are on the larger claims and issues of sexual identities. Does this mean that God hates gay people? Why would he make people this way and then not be able to get married to the person that they love? I would say science and faith, claims about the exclusivity of Christianity, and claims about sexuality are some of the biggest ones. Now, I do hear when I talk to a lot of minority groups, one of the biggest claims that I'll hear is that Christianity is a white man's religion. That is an objection for a lot of people when they look at Christianity that I hear come up somewhat frequently as well.
How would you answer that last one?
How I would answer it is I would say to somebody who go, Christianity is a white man religion. I would say, first off, tell me what you mean by a white man's religion. And what is your evidence that Christianity is a white man's religion? So just in practice, when somebody makes an objection, I'm going to put the burden of proof upon them. And then once I hear them out, I'm going to go back and say, well, let's just go back to the beginning. Well, you look in the Garden of Eden where God creates people is certainly not in Europe or in America where there's white people. You look at the very beginning of the faith, you see people of all skin colors, of all beliefs, far before it's embraced in white countries, so to speak. Christianity is for everybody. I mean, look at the first chapters in Genesis. You see, spread this around the world and you see people of different ethnicities invited to the table. So oftentimes when I hear that, it's more that somebody is associating Christianity just with white people than they've really looked historically at where did Christianity start? Jesus wasn't white. None of his disciples were white. None of the early church were white. They were for all sorts of people, all sorts of backgrounds. It's truly a universal religion. So I just make a distinction between how I personally engage somebody when they make an objection like that and what I think a better response might be.
Yeah, the way you engage people is a freak. You know that? Because nobody's really doing that. I don't know if you've spent 0.23 seconds on any social media platform and immediately truth claim is made, the antithetical truth claim is put, and then it's just name calling. And I love how you just immediately, you ask a question, you allow them to explain their point further, and then, then you respond and answer. And I've seen you in these different interactions on some of the social media platforms or on YouTube. Sometimes you're doing a public speaking event and somebody from the audience poses a question, but you always have this real kind and very calm, cool way that you're going about engaging people. Now, it doesn't mean you're not bringing sick, nasty blows with your arguments, because your points are just, they eviscerate your opponent, but you're doing it in such a nice way. I've seen it over and over again. But my question to you is, how did you develop that approach of ask a question? You're not losing your cool, you're calm, you're hospitable even, you're loving in that. And it's just not a natural kind of response. I see it less and less. Did you develop that? Was that hard? Do you still want to have those cathartic moments where you just crush somebody and do the whole social media thing? Walk us through that.
Well, first off, there's plenty of tweets that I've deleted and people I've apologized to for like not responding the way that I want to. So that's a piece of it. You're on social media. It's just going to bring the worst out of all of us. That's a fact. Now, with that said, I think I would say, I think the ability to be calm and not get offended by somebody is proportional to the level of confidence you have in the position that you hold. So I do this atheist encounter where I role play an atheist and I have audiences ask me questions and I try to respond as an atheist might. And people get defensive. These are Christian audience. They get angry, they get upset. And when I take the glasses off and debrief, I say, why'd you get so angry and upset? I think because you don't really know what you believe. You don't know why God allows evil. You don't really know why you think the Bible is true. And so when I press you on it, it's human nature to get defensive. This is why training in apologetics is so important. It can give us confidence that our positions are true. And that's true in politics. If somebody's talking politics and they know their position and they've studied it and they're prepared to make a case for it, there's a certain calmness that can come with that. But second, I also try to ask myself, what's the most effective way to communicate with somebody? Now, if I was just trying to build a social media platform, I would try to own people and say owning this person, owning that person, because people click and like and share. I get that. That's not the game that I'm playing. I'm trying to be an ambassador for Christ. That matters more to me than building a platform. And the Bible has a lot to say about speaking truth in love. It's your kindness that leads to repentance. I think in our cancel culture, everybody's quick to be angry, but when you just listen and you find common ground and you show grace, which is at the root of the Christian worldview, it actually gives people pause and they go, I have an atheist who watches my stuff. He writes for all these publications. He and I probably agree on almost nothing politically or worldview, but we become friends. He's like, I watch your stuff because you're calm. And it makes me think you have this confidence about what you believe. And that intrigues him. So if we would frame things differently, communication, I studied communications, John, as an undergrad. And really simply put, you have the sender, you have the message, and you have the receiver. Most people on communication are not asking the question, will this content be received well? Rather, they're emoting, they're angry, they're trying to own. They're not actually trying to persuade. They're not actually trying to care for people. They're thinking about the message and the sender, not the receiver. I try to think about the receiver. How do I calm things down? How do I invite conversation? And how do I have somebody actually hear me out? So I think the calmness comes from, one, having confidence in what I believe, and number two, just trying to think through, how do I communicate effectively? Now, with that said, I just did a short this past week, and it was about this divorce lawyer who's like, let me give you advice, live with somebody before you're married. And I responded, I was like, nonsense. That's ridiculous. This guy's a divorce lawyer, and he gets business when you get divorced. Why would you listen to this guy? So there is a time to do that.
Right.
But for the most part, I mean, Proverbs 15 talks about it's a soft word that breaks a bone. A gentle word turns away wrath. So I really just want to treat people the way I hope they would treat me. And no one likes getting insulted on Twitter, so don't insult people.
That's good. Earlier in our discussion, you rattled off a few kind of grim attributes of the Gen Zers coming up. You quoted depression and loneliness. Give us a picture of that, because I have a follow-up question of a young person coming up now. What's kind of the profile picture of who you're encountering with and some of the unsolved problem and angst of soul that they're wrestling with?
So we're seeing depression and anxiety across generations, not just with Gen Z, but Gen Zers who are probably, depend on maybe 13 to like 27 years old, are uniquely in a stage getting affected by this more deeply than you and I might by some of the changes taking place in culture. So, I mean, this is a generation that's very aware of justice issues, things like diversity and inclusiveness are talked about everywhere. Mental health is talked about a ton. I think the lens through which understanding this generation is social media and smartphones. They're the first truly digitally native generation that in many ways, like for me, my default is to communicate offline. And I've learned how to use social media and smartphones and YouTube and other stuff. Their default is online. And many of them have to learn how to communicate offline. I don't take a critical negative view of Gen Z. I have concerns about mental health. I have concerns about worldview affecting them. But I have a very positive. I mean, I have 2 kids who are Gen Zers. I taught a class this morning to Gen Zers. I am hopeful about this generation and see a lot of promise in them.
Right. Your worldview can really have some massive pragmatic effects on your own personal life, your own health, also family. How does the worldview of a person practically filter into some of those issues? Another way to ask it is if some of these folks that are struggling with all these issues all of a sudden accepted a Christian worldview, what might be some of the predictable effects that would transcend into daily living, mental health, relationships, romance, all of that stuff? I think if a worldview or if a philosophy is supposed to actually be true, I think it should be functional. I think it should actually work. It should bear fruit. Poison kills, but something that nourishes is going to bring health. And so I would expect that a correct philosophy of life would lead to good, fruitful living. So maybe speak to us on that.
So it does, John. By the way, the studies, and you know, are very clear that people who live and embrace a Christian worldview, less likely to struggle with mental illness, healthier relationships, happier. Now, if you become I'm not saying become a Christian to make yourself happier. That's not the point. But the point is that if Christianity is true and we live and believe its principles, then we're going to best flourish in life. And that is what we see. Now, this is not specifically what you're asking, but I just had this conversation with a group of students. I'm taking them through, I wrote a book on sexuality for students, and we're walking through God's design for sexuality. And I asked them this question. I said, what would the world be like if everybody actually lived out the sexual ethic of Jesus? What would the world be like? Now, before you ask that, you got to define the sexual ethic of Jesus, that you can live in singleness. That's a good, beautiful way to live. But if you're single, you're not sexually active. Marriage, one man, one woman, one flesh, one lifetime. How would the world be if everybody lived that out? And slowly the students are like, well, there'd be no abortion. And all the damage from that, not only to the child, but can be shown to the mother in so many cases. There'd be no pornography and all the damage from pornography. I saw a major study out of Europe that just talked about how pornography use negatively affects people. It wasn't even a Christian study. Saw that this week. They're like, there'd be no divorce and all the pain from divorce. There'd be no sex abuse. There'd be no crude sexual humor. There'd be less depression, because the more sexually active somebody is outside of a loving, committed relationship, you see a strong correlation with depression. And literally, I looked on the board and I was like, this is why Scripture says that marriage is to be one man, one woman for life, and sex is to be reserved for marriage. God's not trying to steal all our fun. He's actually trying to help us flourish. So you could do that in other areas, but the bottom line, that's a very practical one, because a lot of people, their worldview is they look at the Bible and they're like, well, Scripture's keeping us, God's commands are keeping us from all the fun. God, is sexually repressive. And I say to these students, I'm like, no, if you look on that board, you actually see that God's commands and his worldview, since he's the creator of the world and our bodies and of relationships, if we live this out, we actually objectively flourish better as a result of it. And I would make that case with money. I would make that case in all areas of life, that it's Christian teachings that bring the most flourishing, including just contentment and happiness. So I'll say one more thing. There was a study, get more generally to your question. There was a study, this was in Time a number of years ago, and they walked through all these things that don't make people happy. They're like, education doesn't make people happier. They're like, money doesn't, success doesn't. They said 2 things bring real happiness: a relationship with the divine and meaningful relationships with other people. And I saw that. I'm like, yeah, we don't need science to tell us this. Jesus was asked, what's the greatest commandment? He said, love God and love other people. And studies back up that Christian teachings bring that kind of flourishing.
That's fantastic. I was just, I was thinking about that exact same verse just now, and maybe we're not waiting on all the statistics to come out, but and all the data, but it seems as it does trickle out, it just confirms just such simple, ubiquitous truths that you'd find in Scripture. It works. But I think that folks don't want to believe the Christian worldview is true. It limit their appetites, what they want. And you mentioned something a moment ago that sexual promiscuity outside the confines of marriage is not actually making you happy. It's leading to greater depression. I wish that some of the guys who've been married 10, 15, 20 years in a Christian marriage would be able to speak out on how awesome that monogamy can be. It is clear of like if you poll women and men separately, the folks that are most sexually satisfied are those that are in a healthy marital relationship, not outside hitting the clubs up. But the problem is those people in those relationships aren't kissing and telling. I'm not about to go in to my private sex life and blast that out to the thing, but I wish some of us would, because it just annihilates the hookup culture, the people that talk about it and hold it out as like, this is this amazing thing. I'm like, bro, I look at it and I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't trade what I have for your hookup culture and collecting body counts. I wouldn't trade what I have any day of the week for that. You think you're representing something awesome, and it looks like hollow ash to me. But anyway, I didn't have much of a question there. It's more of just, bro, do you know any good Christian men in happily marriage that'll go kiss and tell for us? Everyone needs to know. It's going very, very well.
You know what's interesting is I think the narrative that Christian teaching is just repressive and it's harmful and steals all your fun is that we don't have enough couples doing what you just did. I'm married and I wouldn't trade it for the world and I love it. Now, of course, you don't need to give any more details than that. Nobody's asking for that. But modeling this to a world, when they hear, oh, it's sexually oppressive, it's like, but I know Christians and they're not living that way. That shows that it's a lie. So modeling this, I'll never forget, it's funny, I was thinking about this last week. When I was in high school, my wife, Stephanie, who you know is with me, we were not married, obviously, in high school. I'm going in to drive in our van. We went on a double date with my parents and some of our friends. And my dad goes, in front of all my friends, he goes, hey, son, why don't you drive? I'm going to sit in the back and make out with your mom.
I love that.
And I about died at that moment, but was like, wow, how many people wish their parents were that passionate? And it stuck with me. And I try to model that appropriately in front of my own kids.
That's awesome. I think that's great, man. If you're on the Jesus track in marriage, that sexual life and that marriage in general is a fine wine that keeps getting much, much better with time when it's done correctly, according to Scripture. You're loving each other as Jesus loved the church, kind of thing. And man, that's all I can do. That's as narrow as my testimony you'll get. But I'm just like, bro, it's a fine wine. You red pillars need to pump the brakes, lean in and listen a moment. Sean.
And hey, let me jump in on that.
Please.
Let me throw one thing. I'm with you 100%. I know there's a lot of people listening that are just like, it didn't work out for me, and I'm not experiencing that. Probably feeling some hurt and brokenness. And I would just say, look, it's not your fault. What's beautiful about Christianity is that there's grace and there's redemption and there's healing. That's a part of the Christian message too. So we flourish when we live as God's design, but because of sin, so many of us, all of us in different ways, fall short of that. If you fall short, man, there is healing and grace and redemption in Christianity. We love you and want to see you getting back to experiencing relationally what God has for you.
I love that you hit the brakes there for those who have had a more difficult time. Those who have maybe had an unsuccessful marriage or unsuccessful relationship. I see some of those guys angry, and they are angry at women in general, giving up on marriage, giving up on faith. Do you have another word for them? Now that you went a little bit, I'm like, man, go even further. Let's help some folks, because relationships are really, there's some real successful ones, and then there's a lot of hurt out there too.
This morning with a group of high school students, I was talking about what the deepest yearning of the human heart is. And they all concluded that we want intimacy, meaning to know and be known by another person. By the way, you can have sex without being intimate. And in that sense, you can be intimate with somebody without having sex. They said the deepest human yearning, and this is what heaven is going to be like, is that we can know people, but we put a mask up and we protect ourselves because of our insecurities, because of our brokenness, and because of our failures. So to a guy in that position, I'd say, man, I get it. I've been there. I've been hurt. I've seen failures, and it's totally understandable to be angry in the way that you are and want to protect yourself. But I am telling you, there's so much goodness and richness in allowing yourself to experience God's grace, to experience healing from that, leaning in healthy in relationships. That's what life is for, to know God and know others. So you might say it's easy for me to say this, and I'm not saying it as if it's easy, but I want to say I get it. There's grace for you. Don't keep living out in light of that hurt. I've seen so many people have been through that hurt and like, you know what? It's not easy. I'm going to risk. I'm going to make myself vulnerable, and I'm going to do it again, and then see deep richness on the other side. That's the hope that Christianity has to offer.
That's awesome. Thank you. You got anything coming up? Anything in the pipeline, new books or anything?
I do. I've always got fun interviews and topics I'm talking about on YouTube, kind of in this lane of worldview. But John, because you are my buddy, I'm going to make literally the first announcement on your show. I have a book that really, probably more than any book, captures my heart of how to have conversations with people who see the world differently.
You are the one to do that book. You're a guy to write that book. I'm already sold. I don't even know the name of it. I don't know any premise. I just know, Sean. I know how you argue. I'm going to get that book. So you already got a customer.
I appreciate you saying that. I co-wrote it with a friend of mine who's a communications scholar, PhD in communications, Tim Muehlhoff, masterful communicator. He does a lot of like the academic backing, and I'm like, here's practically how you do this. It's called End the Stalemate. Comes out, I think, in June, and it's for not only politically, but for your family, at work, for anybody you know who sees the world differently. Here's how you can lean in, find some common ground, have productive conversations in a really incarnational way, because Christianity says that God took on human flesh, enters into our world, and we have a high priest who understands. Like, it's powerful. What if we as Christians led by saying, I'm going to enter into your worldview, I'm going to enter into your life and try to see the world as you do, charitably first? That's powerful. And my dad said to me, it's more important to understand than to be understood. So that book, End the Stalemate, I could not be more excited about it. And because you're my buddy, there you have it, first announcement.
We are thrilled to hear it. Where's the best place that folks can interact with you?
So my website, just seanmcdowell.org, has links to my blog, has links to my Twitter feed, has links to my YouTube channel, my speaking. And so really it depends on what platforms people use. I love YouTube. I've really come to enjoy modeling the kind of conversations that we're talking about on YouTube. So that's a great place. If people are watching this there, follow that channel. And I have a lot of these conversations, and I just do a lot on apologetics. I have conversations coming up on near-death experiences, how I think they're evidence for the afterlife. I have some conversations come up with some former Muslims who just had radical experiences that brought them to the Christian faith. I have a conversation coming up I had with an atheist. So if people want to probe in more deeply into the kind of stuff we're talking about, probably YouTube would be the primary place.
Well, fantastic. We will throw your links down below. Sean, thanks so much for tuning in with us. We had a fantastic time and hope to have you back in the future.
John, I loved it, and pun intended.
That's awesome. All right, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. This is Sean McDowell, and guys, we'll see you next time.